With the Stardew Valley 1.6 major update being released recently, I wanted to honor the real protagonist of the Stardew Valley cinematic universe. That's right, it's not you, it isn't Shane or Haley, it isn't even the wizard, although he is the main character in my life. The real protagonist is Hat Mouse. This deviously adorable business overlord is a fan favorite and for good reason, so today we'll be making a tiny diorama for him that legally could be considered a shrine. Okay, so to start, we're gonna have to cut out some walls, and for that, I'm using foam board that I fished out of a trash can in front of the dollar store. I made a little template for myself to follow out of printer paper, and I cut out 2 of each wall types, as well as the door and 2 windows. After cutting those out, I used a small ruler as a guide to cut the corners of each wall at a diagonal so we could glue them together perfectly. And by perfectly, I mean have them turn out slightly mediocre and uneven, and have the most insane case of artist shakes that I've ever had in my life. But it's okay because all this foam is getting covered up by coffee stir sticks anyway, and the next step will also be very forgiving because we're cutting into the foam to make the giant holes that riddle this abandoned farmhouse. Legend has it that these holes were created when the terrifying mouse mogul got scammed out of a fedora, but the historical records were wiped, so we'll never know for sure. Do you feel educated yet? Good, because now that I have you updated on all the hidden lore of the valley, it's time to add a copious amount of coffee stir sticks. So I'm not going to cut out the holes in the foam just yet. I used a pencil to outline them, and I'm going to trim each stir stick to the right size and to fit around where I outlined first. This way, if I make one of the holes bigger or smaller, I only need to trim away the foam instead of the wood. Also, this process was so satisfying. My name isn't Robin, but I sure felt like her for a minute there. And I usually trim down the sticks to the size of the wall I was working on first, and then I drew on where I wanted it to look broken so I could use my X-Acto knife to cut that part out. Then I used some hot glue to secure it to the foam and repeated that process about a million bajillion times. Once the foam base was completely covered with stir sticks, it was time to cut out all those open foam parts. I used the wood as a guide for my X-Acto knife since there are so many sharp ends, and I worked my way around the entire building. So once I got them all cut out, I made the executive decision to not put stir sticks on the inside because oh my god, that took me so long. But instead, indent wooden texture into the inside foam, which was a lot more time and sanity efficient. And because it was so much more time efficient, wow, we're already done with it, which means it's time to rough out a base for this bad boy. Wait, why did I say it like that? It's time to rough out a base for this bad boy. You know what? Never mind. For this base, I'm just using 1 sheet of XPS foam and cutting it to a rough size that I like. I'm actually gonna make it just a smidge bigger so I have room to carve. Also, pause, I would like to add something to keep in mind for the rest of the video. I got a puppy recently. Wow, yes, so here he is. This is Shadow. Everyone comment how handsome he is and how ConcernedApe should add my 2 sons into Haunted Chocolatier. But yeah, so if you see any cuts on my hands and or arms, they're due to him, they're his fault, so just ignore them and back to the video. Okay, so if you've seen any of my other videos, you would know I enjoy making cool bases for all of my projects, and typically I want to relate them back to the game. And luckily for me, there is a cliff right near where Hat Mouse stationed his hat empire, so I'm gonna use that as my inspiration and try to get as close as I can to it. After cutting out a rectangle and adding curved edges to it, I began roughing out where I wanted all the stones to be with a pencil. Thankfully, rocks are very rarely perfect, so we're not aiming to be symmetrical or smooth. I used my X-Acto knife to cut around where I drew all of the circles and try to separate them as best I can. After getting about halfway through, here's a little before and after. It's definitely shaping up, but we have a little bit more work to do until it's worthy of being the ground that Hat Mouse walks on. So I'm gonna finish separating all of them, and then I'm gonna go back in and start carving them out a bit more so they look less flat and a bit more organic. And here's your second before and after. You can definitely see the flat edge of the foam on the side that I didn't carve, but after I finish that, I use a ball of aluminum foil to indent some rock wrinkles into the entire base. And now we have the general shape and texture ready to rock. But I want to make sure that Hat Mouse is really cemented into this base, so I'm carving out a little tunnel on the top of the foam that lines up with the bottom of the house. And with that done, it's time to mix up some paint, so I'm going to start mixing the color that'll go on the outside of the house. Wait. So what you just heard right there was a real-time discovery. I almost forgot to add the corner pieces all around the house. So before we paint, I'm gonna add those and a few other minor details that I'll need to paint as well. And once all that was on, I could make use of the beautiful color we mixed up and start to paint the outside of the house. And after painting on a few layers outside, I begin the same process on the inside, just with a brown instead of a yellow. I also did some dry brushing on the inside, and while we let that dry, we can move on to painting the base. I first started with a medium brown and layered on a few lighter shades of paint over that once it dried. And the next major step is to add some grass to this base. It's looking a little bald right now. We'll add more foliage later, but for now, let's just worry about the grass. The first thing I'm gonna add are the stepping stones in front of Hat Mouse's little desk where he commits little tax fraud. Then to make sure the grass looks nice and full, I'm painting the top of the base with a few shades of green. Now once that's all dry, I mix up some Mod Podge with the same shade of green to hopefully hide it a bit better, and we can finally add our static grass. It looks a bit busted because I use some grass that I don't like very much but also don't want to waste, but then again that's kind of on brand for this little mouse house. Finally, we can glue the house onto the base and start working on the inside. Now unfortunately, you never get to see the inside of this house in game, so everything from here on out isn't canon mouse lore, but I tried to make the inside make sense for the kind of shrewd shrew that occupies this building. The first thing I wanted to add was a busted wooden floor where you can see patches of the grass growing out from under it. I used some popsicle sticks for this part, that way the thickness of these sticks are different from the sticks on the outside of the house. And speaking of the sticks on the outside of the house, I asked my patrons if I should dry brush the outside because for some reason I just hadn't done it yet and I kind of got used to that yellow, but luckily they diligently guided me to the best option, and I'm glad they did because I think the dry brushing really adds a lot to the weathered feel of the building. Anyway, with that done, it's time to work on Hat Mouse's little desk at the front, and for that I'm using a thick stick of craft wood that I cut to size, and some cut up popsicle sticks to detail it. Finally, I could paint it to match the house and the floors of this building. And after I glue the desk down, it's time to work on all the frames for the windows and the front entrance. For these frames, I use popsicle sticks and cut them in certain areas so they look broken and torn, and once I like how they look, I give them a coat of ivory colored paint and attach them to their rightful place. Now once the frames were all on, I thought they looked a bit too clean, so I went over all of them with a super light brown wash. I added some more frame to the rest of the windows and the entrance just to clean them up a bit and painted them to match. Now in my head, Hat Mouse is a very successful businessman, or business mouse. I mean, like, not to read you or anything, but he got you to go into the middle of the woods, alone, with a poorly written letter that also demanded you bring cash, and you fell for it. He's basically a genius, and a genius business mouse like that needs a good amount of space for his inventory, so we're adding a second floor. I cut a piece of foam board to the right size, paneled it with coffee stir sticks, and painted it brown. I cut off the ends of those weirdly detailed toothpicks you see around sometimes to act as the banister, painted it the same color, and glued them both to the rest of the house. With those securely attached, it's time to make a bunch of crates. Obviously, we made a second floor to hold Hat Mouse's inventory, so it would be very weird if he didn't have any boxes or hats laying around. To not be wasteful, I'm taking the extra XPS foam that I cut off when making the base and cut those scraps into smaller cubes and rectangular prisms. From there, it was just covering all of them with wooden things. Mostly coffee stir sticks, but I thought it would be boring if I did the same kind of box over and over again. And also, a business mouse like this is bound to have a bunch of different suppliers, so I took my time making a bunch of adorably different tiny crates. Once I had a good selection, I painted all of them a few different colors and dry brushed them to give them a more aged appearance. Now, typically shipping crates have a bunch of different mumbo jumbo on them, like what side is the top, logos, directions, all that stuff. So to add a cute twist, I went through all of them and painted on a bunch of tiny details. And once I was satisfied, I began gluing them down inside and outside the house. Hat Mouse also has some red curtains hanging above him, so I grabbed some scrap fabric and used hot glue to add some ruching. I also added a little frame around it on the inside because it looked a bit too busted even for Hat Mouse. Okay, Hat Mouse this, Hat Mouse that, it's time to actually sculpt him. This is probably the easiest thing from clay I've ever made, aside from a Korok from The Legend of Zelda, but I wanted to stay as true to what he looks like in the original game. He's got a rotund head, some round ears that are just balls of clay I indented with a ball stylus, a triangle nose, and some tic-tac eyes. Because I pre-baked the eyes, I didn't have to worry about smushing them, and instead I could focus on smoothing out the clay around them with some alcohol. Once I was happy with how he was looking, I took my smallest ball stylus tool and began adding some fur texture. I smoothed him out with some more alcohol and chucked him in an oven to bake. Once he was cured, I could add some smaller details to him without ruining any of the other things that I've already added. I'm gonna give him some adorably small tufts of fur, whiskers, and a nose. Now right now, the only thing we have is a mouse. An armless and legless mouse. But before he can be a mouse with arms and legs, he needs to be a mouse with a hat. So I sculpted a very simple one right on top of his head. And after baking that, I finally decided it was time to give him limbs. So I added some adorable feet with toe beans that matched his shipping logos and some arms that would rest perfectly on his desk. Okay, so we have mouse, we have hat mouse, but we don't have hat. So we make hat. I actually chose some of my favorite from the game itself, starting off with a little cowboy hat. Next up is the good old cap, because everyone needs a good old cap. And for all of you corporate sellouts out there, we have a Joja hat. I also make a Santa hat, a witch's hat, a green turban, and of course a top hat. After they're all baked, I paint them in their respective colors. Almost every hat has been painted so far, so the last hat is of course the most important one. But before we can paint the hat, we have to paint the mouse. Starting off with a gray that almost perfectly blended into the color of the clay somehow, I blend in some white on his snout, ears, arms, and anywhere else I feel like. His nose and eyes get a pure black, and his hat gets a vivacious lime green. His toe beans get a nice pink, even though we will sadly never see them again, and his cheeks get an adorable circle of blush. And after we paint all of this, we can glue down the merchandise and the mouse merchant himself. With everything on the inside of the structure in place, it's time to seal it all with a roof, and we're going to be using some cardboard from a popcorn and tea box. Boxes for food are usually really nice to use in crafts because they're very clean looking and they aren't too thick. So I'll cut them down into even strips and begin texturing them a little bit to make them look like individual shingles. After I do that to enough of them, I tape them all together for the time being and start to add holes to the roof. I'm adding a few more than there are in the game just because I want you to be able to see all this stuff on the inside better. Also, before I glue this roof down, I used the extra material from the desk we made earlier to make sure the upper parts of the walls were straight. Once we had that ceiling beam in, I used a copious amount of hot glue to secure the shingles to the roof, and then I used super glue between each layer of shingles for added strength. Once all the tape was off and the roof was strongly secure, we could start painting, and I'm going in first with a layer of dark red. I almost forgot to add a circle of craft foam for where a little chimney will go later, and craft foam shingles, which now that I said that kind of sounds like the cheese, craft foam shingles. Anyway, I added those at the top of the roof and painted them all the same color. For the chimney, I'm using a milkshake straw that I painted black and then topped off with a gunmetal gray. The rest of the roof tiles are painted orange and dry brushed with increasingly lighter oranges and even some yellows. I felt like after all the layers of paint, the individual shingles were kind of lost. So I took some of the red we used as primer, watered it down, and painted it in the lines between the shingles to redefine them. Finally, it's foliage and flocking time, which is everyone's favorite part of any miniature craft. However, the bushes in Stardew Valley are so beautiful and full of leaves that I wasn't confident enough to make them myself, so instead I caved and bought some fake ferns and leaves from a craft store. I'm also using actual flocking for the first time, and someone needs to take it away from me because I won't be able to stop myself in the future. I want someone to flock my own coffin. That's how much I love this stuff now. And by the way, all this greenery isn't actually on the building in the game, but I don't think anyone would complain if it was, so I'm doing it anyway. Also, I think it really enhances all of the textures, so I went around the entire building and added some anywhere that moisture might realistically gather. I used another piece of scrap fabric to paint the banner that goes at the front. You'll never guess what it says. And finally, I add the bigger bushes and ferns all around the base to make it feel less empty. I glue the cut up branches together, paint some of the stems brown, and glue them right into the base. And on that note, Poke, I think we've done all we have to do. So you just sit back, maybe come to old house, perhaps even bring some coins to enjoy these glorious final shots. And as always, I have to thank my patrons, but especially my new DIYers, Amber Marie, Paige B, Whitney L, Naranhart, and Adventures of Henry and Peter, and my glorious new artificer, Pete Moss. Without your coyness, this old house wouldn't be able to sell crafts, so thank you for all of your support. Anyway, thank you for watching until the end. If you have any suggestions for the next craft I do, definitely leave it in the comments down below. And while you're at it, go watch all of my other videos while you try to date the entire town to see their new cutscenes. Thanks for watching, Poke, and I will see you next time.